Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Spencer here, as well as myself, Brad. And today we're talking about analyzing threat reports for defenders. And so, really what we're talking about, there's tons of threat reports out there. We're going to get into like why they matter, what we can use them for, and more importantly, like what can you get out of them that's relevant and useful in your day-to-day life. And we're targeting this episode for defenders, but there's obviously value for offenders as well. I don't know if that's can I use that phrase? I'm not sure. Probably going to get canceled. All right. You want to tell us,
Definitely.
what your thought process was, kind of building this episode out.
Yeah, for sure. So this is something I've been thinking about for a while and been wanting to kind of cover on the podcast. I also plan to make another like separate video, like a specific walkthrough video for this on my channel to kind of like go through some various reports, like the DFIR report, Talos, Mandiant, now part of Google, kind of just look at some of these reports in depth and kind of help people take things away or just identify things that I notice. So there'll be more to come on this because I think it's a really interesting topic. But kind of to set the stage is threat reports are a gold mine for defenders. They're a gold mine for pen testers and red teamers and kind of everybody in security. I think there is, no matter what your role, you can pull away some insight, some key thing from most of these reports. And I think knowing how to go through the reports or just having a methodology for it, knowing what things are important, kind of trying to identify how you can cut through the noise in the reports and kind of weed through them and pull out the interesting bits and apply what really matters or what matters to you, to your industry, to your organization, I think is a tremendous asset to securing your organization. And I think many times, you can find just like one little nugget in, the hour that you spend reading a report is worth it because that thing ends up, turning into something that maybe is a gap in your environment, or it means you're able to catch an attack early on versus, missing it entirely or not being aware of some technique that's being abused in the wild. So that is kind of like the why this matters kind of portion of it. And I think there's obviously no shortage of threat intel, threat reports out there. And I think the big challenge and kind of why I wanted to do this podcast and make a larger episode or video series on this is the hard part is making sense of it and getting the most out of those reports. So that's what we're going to be doing in this podcast, talking about threat reports, how to analyze them, what we think is important, and kind of how we, think about approaching this task of pulling out insights from these reports and hopefully give you some actionable tips and advice that you can immediately implement in your own security programs today. So, yeah.
Awesome. Love it, dude. Yeah, so Mike Witt was on this show a couple episodes ago. It might have been late last year. I worked for Mike Witt for like 14 years. He kind of, I would say, is the closest thing I've ever had to like a full-on mentor of how to do cybersecurity. And under his direction in the banking environments that we were in, when these threat reports came out, it was my job to go through them and identify what's relevant to us. And, obviously we're looking for things in the banking market vertical. What can we do with this information? We would often build tabletops, like full on, executive level and technical level tabletops around what we learned from these threat reports to evaluate our readiness. So, it is a lot of good information, but you do have to be careful not to drink from the fire hose too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really what you're going to teach us how to do today is like identify the things that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. And just to level set on some terminologies and things like that, I think everybody can kind of identify what a threat report is. They're published by vendors many times, by research organizations, governments even, or government agencies like CISA. So we're talking Cisco Talos and Microsoft and Mandiant's, the DFIR report, CISA, all these kind of organizations and outfits publish reports all the time. And there's probably a new report every single day of the week, I would imagine.
It seems like
a lot of them have a lot of marketing spin on them. A lot of them have biases and kind of preconceived notions, and they're kind of trying to push an agenda and that agenda being like selling their product, which is absolutely
Mhm.
fine, like business, cool. But that's one of the things you got to be mindful of. So we'll get to some of those kind of things to look out for. But what kind of key components of a threat report, right, Brad? IOCs, I think that's a common thing that people look for. So IP
Mhm.
addresses, domains, hashes, the technical breadcrumbs, if you will. Those are the
Yep.
things that are, the tangible things in the report that you can key off of to identify suspicious activity or behavior in your environment. So that's one of the things we're going to talk through and kind of identify in these reports.
Yeah, so those of you that aren't familiar with the term IOC, those are indicators of compromise. They are usually technical items that surprisingly enough, indicate you may be compromised. So yeah, that's where that's derived from. But yeah, like you mentioned, IPs are a really good one. Certain tooling, certain behaviors, all of those can kind of give us an idea that a something bad's going on in our environment, and b in some cases we can identify or narrow down the threat actor itself based on what those IOCs are. So
Yep. And some outfits will use indicators of attack, or they will use some other terminology for, the threat actors techniques or the tools or the kind of the breadcrumbs. Really, again, it's like the IOCs are like the breadcrumbs that you can pull on, the threads you can pull.
yeah,
Then you get to the TTPs, right? Which is the tactics, techniques, and procedures.
you've
Those
definitely
are
heard
the
that on this show. More than once, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's core to what offensive security is, right? It's our
Yeah.
means and methodologies and techniques. So that's the things that the attackers were actually doing, the tools they were using, like you mentioned, the way they were using the tools, the kind of the techniques that they choose to exploit a certain thing or
Mhm.
to move laterally. Maybe they use WinRM, or maybe they use RDP,
Mhm.
so kind of identifying what method or what technique they're using for a given situation is important, and those are insights we can pull out. And then there's attribution and context, which attribution can be a difficult thing, but who's behind the attack and what do they want? And it might not necessarily be, like who is the individual on the keyboard or which nation state, but I think of for, a small business or something like that as like who is it? Is it a nation state? Is it a ransomware group? Is it a financially motivated cybercrime gang? Is it a hacktivist? Like who is kind of like the there's a word for it. What's the psychology or what's
Modus
the
operandi.
yeah. Yeah, like who is it and what are they
Mhm.
after? Those are also insights you can pull from these reports as well.
Yep.
So if it's a report that's like, hey, Microsoft got hacked, it's probably going to be a pretty sophisticated actor. They're going to have some varying goals that it's going to be different from the ransomware group that compromises the law firm that down the street, right?
Yep.
So just to give an example.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to understand as much as you can about their MO, how they operate, what they're looking for. If I'm a payment card processor, right, and somebody hits my organization, and we know they're after payment data, we kind of already know, where to run, right? Or by contrast, if I am, I don't know, a construction company, and it's a threat actor that's looking for payment card data, well, I don't house that. And so, we were either accidentally attacked, or, there's a different MO in play, or maybe they got in and they just didn't realize what they had, which is actually pretty common. So yeah, to
Yep.
your point, context, surprisingly enough, context is everything. And so, yeah, you really need to understand these, because if you do, you can be one step ahead, right? Once you identify those initial IOCs.
Yep. Exactly. So I think we kind of laid out kind of what we're looking for, why it kind of matters. Let's talk about goals
Hmm.
of analyzing a threat report. So we talked about this a little bit already in like what is a threat report and kind of like defining those things.
Hmm.
But we want to analyze threat reports for a couple, varying reasons. One, we want to understand what the threat actors are doing, because they might be trying to use those same TTPs, those same techniques against us, against our organization. And that could be us as a industry, that could be us as a XYZ law firm or insurance company or
Hmm.
university. So we want to read these threat reports and understand what threat actors are doing, how they're doing them, why they're doing them, and kind of the specific things that they're doing so we can help build defenses. We can look at our security program, our posture, our controls, and map coverage and determine all those things, which we're going to kind of get into a little bit more.
Yeah.
Detections is another thing that's very common, right? You pull IP addresses and hashes from the report, you send them to your EDR vendor, or you throw them in your SIM, and you kind of create block lists and rules based on those specific detections. So there are very real, tangible examples of just pulling something out from a report, dropping it in your EDR, and then being able to block that specific tool or that specific malware, right? So there are detection opportunities as well.
Yep. And we do that here, right? So we have a managed SOC that's a SOC as a service for our clients. And every single week there is a threat researcher or more threat researchers that are going through all of this material. Because like you said, it comes out like all the time. There's tons of it. And so they're analyzing that, they're adding signatures, testing detections, and then a lot of times what we'll do is we'll retroactively scan for IOCs based on new detection capabilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like if a threat actor comes out, they have this particular, to your point, TTP, but we don't find out about how to detect that or what it is until 6 months after they've been operating. So we'll retroactively review the information that we have to identify, historical activity. So, yeah, I mean, it's just one way that we use this same
Yep.
methodology that you're talking about here.
Yeah, the threat hunting aspects of that can be really beneficial for SOCs, for MSPs, and things like that.
Yeah.
So understanding our potential gaps is the third bullet point here, and that is if a threat actor is using a certain technique, or they're exploiting a certain product, or a vulnerability in a certain piece of software, or something like that, you can look at that and say, oh, we have Confluence. Is it up to date? If it's not, you probably already know about it. But on a serious note, those are things you can pull out, like, oh, this threat actor is looking for these external holes to exploit, and they're looking at the Confluences or the Palo Altos and kind of the Citrix RCEs and all that fun stuff. But identifying those things through these reports, you can kind of understand what your potential gaps are, right? You can go back, you can test, you can validate, look at your systems, look at your versions, and kind of understand if you have gaps there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what we would do, right? Is look at what our control capabilities are, and we would literally implement specific controls around threat actors, right? Because we were fortunate to be in that very specific market vertical of the financial industry. And so we knew by name most of the threat actors that were targeting financial institutions,
Mm.
right? And so we were studying their stuff, man, and learning as much as we could about them. And we had very, very specific controls that would kind of break the chain, if you will, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit. But yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. This is a really good list of goals. We did the same thing.
Yep. And then the last goal that I think is important is testing and validating prevention and detection, right?
Yep.
If there are specific tools being used, if there are specific techniques being used, you can take those, implement those in your environment, or test those in your environment rather, and see, does SharpHound get blocked in my environment? If I run it on a host without EDR, do I get any alerts? Is this lateral movement technique with an admin account being detected in my environment, right? If I RDP from Susie's machine in accounting, or a machine that looks like that, to a domain controller, am I getting alerts for that? So you can take kind of the techniques and pull them out and use them as like a purple team, right? Use them as unit testing for your security controls, for your detection and response systems and your prevention systems.
Yep. If only we knew somebody that does purple teams, like custom, I mean,
Right?
I feel like that would be a cool service.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, yeah, man. No, you're absolutely right. And we would literally go so far as to whatever tooling they had, we would get it if it was available, right? To
Mm-hmm.
your point, like SharpHound, Bloodhound, those are really good ones. But we would even go so far in some cases as to replicate the functionality of tools we didn't have. And a really good example of that is like auto encrypting ransomware. And so we would set up detections so that if certain file extensions showed up somewhere, right? Whether it be a local PC or a file share or whatever it is,
Yep.
that we would use NAC to just disable the network,
Yep.
like shut that sucker down. And so, there, even if you don't have the tooling or access to all the things that they do, you can replicate some of those behaviors with a Python script or something, which is what we
Yep.
did.
Yeah, definitely. And we have some examples that I think I have some examples in my notes of like
Mhm.
how we can kind of emulate some of this stuff. But that's what we talk about to clients who come to us and are like, "Hey, do you guys do purple teaming?" We're like, "Yeah, totally. This is what it looks like for us. It's
Mhm.
very unit-based testing. It's procedure-based testing, meaning we're testing specific, atomic things like the atomic testing framework, right? We're
Mhm.
testing for specific things. We're not testing, do you detect sharp pound? We're detecting, okay, maybe you detect the sharp pound that when it's compiled and pulled off GitHub, right? Great. It's probably signature. It's going to be, or we know it's going to be blocked. What we're really interested in is if the threat actor obfuscates it or if they're somehow able to execute it in your environment, are you going to see it not on the endpoint? In other words, are you going to see it other than on the endpoint?
Mhm.
So those are the things that we look at from a unit testing perspective, an atomic level, to see is this technique or is this procedure being detected or not, and that's kind of how we approach our purple teams.
Mhm. Agreed.
So getting into kind of more of the nuts and bolts of this, like how do we actually go about analyzing the threat report? I've got, I don't know, 3 or 4 different kind of techniques, if you will, or methodologies
Mhm.
that I think of when I look at these threat reports. And if those resonate with you or you get value from that, I'd love to know. And kind of, I'd love to hear whoever's listening, share with us what you use and kind of what your techniques are for going through these threat reports, because somebody else, you might have like a unique perspective that somebody else wouldn't think of or that we wouldn't think of based on your experiences that might help somebody. So
Yeah.
feel free to share in the comments or on social media like what you do and kind of how you pick these apart.
Yep.
Skimming. So the quickest and easiest way I think I can think of is you just go through the report and look at what's interesting, right? Like you just skim through it, be like, oh, that looks interesting. Let me read that. That looks interesting. Let me read that. Or just
Yep.
go through and pick certain sections that look interesting to you, or that you just have some idea that you would be curious to look at, and look at the IOCs. Pull out IOCs, look at the TTPs for that,
Mhm.
and kind of match those things to your environment or your industry. That's a lot of times the first step that I do is I skim through it to see if it's even worth reading in depth. And then if it is, I'm like, oh yeah, this has got some potentially good stuff. Then I'll kind of decide to go through it with a finer tooth comb to really pick out things, pull out things that I think are super important.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, right? There are different categories of threat reports, right? So there are like general threat reports, like the Verizon data breach report is a
Mhm.
really good example of that. They got all kinds of stuff in there, man. They're targeting manufacturing and critical infrastructure, et cetera, and so forth. But there are absolutely threat reports out there that focus on market verticals, right? Like there is a critical infrastructure threat report. There is a financial version of that same thing. And so you may be able to kind of narrow your scope a little bit by focusing on some threat reports that are more geared toward your industry if you're
Yep.
in something like that. Now, if you're like a law firm, for example, you kind of have to read everything. Right, because everybody's coming after you, right? Anybody that's running one of these shops is going to consider you a target. However, the more specialized industries, usually have some dedicated threat reports that you can look at.
Yep.
I would still recommend looking at all of them, but you can prioritize your time a little bit, right? If you want to, based on the target
Yep.
audience of the threat reports.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good point. At least the next thing is like prioritizing, focusing on high confidence indicators and kind of the relevant attack behaviors is what I wrote in my notes. And that
Yeah.
is, focusing on the things that in the report that are known confidence level things. Like
Hmm.
in the reports, a lot of times in threat intel reports and stuff, it'll say, we have a moderate confidence that this is, attributed to threat actor XYZ, right?
Yeah, honey
Or we
bear
have,
or whatever goofy name they give these things, man.
yeah, Volt Typhoon or Strawberry Rainflower or,
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly, exactly.
Microsoft recently changed their names, and there was like a big hubbub in like the community of like changing the naming convention. There's a bunch of memes, and I just think of like, you pick an animal from your favorite animal plus your favorite flavor of ice cream plus like whatever, and it's like that's how you name the threat actor. I don't
Yeah,
know.
man. I don't know, but I will tell you, if I'm a threat actor, I'm going to be really offended if I get something like fluffy teddy bear as opposed to like
Yep.
angry spider, right? Like I want
Yep.
something cool, and so I'm going to be upset if
I
I get
mean,
something.
I if it were me naming the threat groups, I would name them as offensive as possible to them, right? Like
Oh man,
clown, like overweight clown spider, or like like just make them not seem super cool.
I
Like
love
some
it.
vendors do, and it's
Yep,
like, yeah.
I love that. That's awesome.
But yeah, some reports will say, we have a moderately high confidence level that whatever, right? So, and others won't. Others will just kind of show you data and statistics. So, the first kind of, or the next step is when you're going through it, looking for things that you have a relatively high level of confidence are things that that threat actor is doing, and kind of not reading between the lines too much in terms of the assumptions of like what they did to get to that point,
Hmm.
or if there's information missing, make sure that you're not kind of like putting your own biases or your own kind of experiences in for that, and kind of just reading it for what it is.
Yeah.
Um, there are times for that where you want to interpret things, and I think that is all well and good. But just that's something that I have noticed in my own readings, like, oh, there's some information missing here. Let's just focus on what we know to be true that's in the report or relevant to us,
Yep.
and kind of eliminate everything else. And that prioritization, or that focusing on what's relevant is a key kind of thing to, like you said, limit the overwhelm or the fire hose, drinking from a fire hose thing of like,
Yeah.
there's so much in here. It's like, just focus on what you know and what you can control kind of things, and what's relevant to you.
Yeah. It's the only way to keep from being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So it's a really good point.
The next one is validation. So once you've gone through skimming, you've kind of looked at some of the stuff that's most important that you've kind of prioritized. The next step is potentially validating. So that's where we talked about running tools in your environment. Maybe you are running Splunk queries, or Elastic queries, or Microsoft Sentinel. You're doing threat hunting in your environment, like you mentioned. That's an aspect of this.
Hmm.
You're looking at other threat intel platforms to validate the IOCs that you found.
Hmm.
Now, all of these things might not be something that you would do, but these are all things you could potentially do to kind of validate the findings from a report,
Hmm.
right? So there are organizations like VirusTotal and Abuse IPDB. There are what do they call them? Information sharing kind of threat intel resources where you can go and you can look up IP addresses, you can look up certain information, and you kind of cross reference or validate certain things. So if you're looking at a threat actor's IP address, or you're pivoting on some certificate that was found in their C2 communication or something like that, you can use that to pivot and kind of validate, like, oh yeah, this threat actor is known to use Sliver C2 or to originate from this country, that kind of thing. So that also plays into the validation of this as well. And then internal logs and your own kind of detection stack. You can see,
Yeah.
you can take those indicators, you can look in your own logs and see, are those things potentially in my environment? Do I have detections for them? Is a really important aspect of this validation part.
Yep. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Things like Move It, Solar Winds. Those are really good examples. I like those stories, and I like that incident, um, because it was one threat actor. They had very specific TTPs, and it's a well-studied incident, right? And so you can build frameworks around these well-studied incidents to understand what information you need, how to react to it, so you can do some historical stuff to prepare yourself. Because I think there might be um, some trepidation there with regards to starting um, a threat report review program within your organization if you've never done one. Right, it can kind of
Mhm.
be a little overwhelming, depending on the experience and the skill set that you have in your organization. But again, as practice cases, go back and study some of those really well-known, well-documented incidents, and that will help you kind of pave the path forward for these. So you're not starting on something that's bleeding edge and new. You might not even realize that there are components missing, like you mentioned in
Yep.
these reports. So I would encourage people to do practice runs on this. And then I'll let you get back to it because I just kind of jumped into a side
Yeah, no,
mission
that's
there.
that's a great point. Is if you're an IT admin or a cybersecurity analyst, a SOC analyst, or even like an IT director, CISO kind of thing,
Mhm,
there are certain things that you're going to notice or pull out that others may not, and you're going to have a certain experience level with that.
mhm.
Um, Obviously, picking the right reports is key. Like if
Yeah.
you're a sysadmin and you administer Active Directory, you're probably not going to be looking at like the latest Kubernetes like threat reports,
Oh yeah.
or the latest serverless architecture security reports or whatever. So picking the report is important, like you mentioned, and just going through the process and kind of getting familiar with it is a good idea. So mapping. So the last kind of section before we go through like a little walkthrough is mapping, and that is again, and we're kind of like increasing in maturity. I feel like going down this list. Like the
We
first
are.
step is skimming, pulling out some things that you can walk away from.
Mhm,
Next, we're going to prioritize certain things to look at. Then we're going to validate things, and then we're going to like map that and actually build structure around how we review this and kind of the actions that we take as a follow up. So I think of pyramid of pain, right? Like what hurts the threat actors the most. You can look at these threat reports and say, okay, I see that they're using RDP to move laterally, and they really like AnyDesk, right? They like
mhm,
AnyDesk for persistence. Well, what if we blocked all RMMs? There's a website called lolrmm.io. You can go to it. You can get all the information about all the RMMs that they have in their database, which is like 200 something plus. Download all the list and just send it to your EDR and just block them all, except for the
mhm.
ones you're using, right? Just block them all from like an application control perspective. And then they can't run, or at least it's harder for them to run, right?
Yep.
That makes it much more difficult for the threat actors. They like a GUI. Many of them like getting on the or they don't like getting on the console and like using commands, right? They mess it up all the time, but they do like the GUI. They like the GUI. They like RMMs. They like RDP and stuff like that. So if you're looking at the reports in the context of pyramid of pain, what hurts threat actors the most? Take away their most prized thing, which is after initial access, it's lateral movement, right?
Mhm,
Um, and then you can also map those to MITRE. If you're a MITRE attack, TTP kind of person, if you have some intelligence or if you're using those frameworks in your environment, or if you're getting reports, right? If you get pen test reports like ours, we associate our attack techniques with MITRE techniques
mhm,
because it's a common framework. It's a common language across the industry. So we will use those TTPs in a report, and you can use those yourself from a defensive standpoint. So what
mhm.
TTPs are being used the most frequently, which ones are maybe the most impactful, or which one in the specific report was the one that allowed the threat actor to kind of have their way with the environment. There's a lot of different ways you can look at that.
Yep. Yeah, and focus on choke points, right? So if they have a breadth of, let's say, lateral movement tools, and you can't block all of those, don't have that mechanism or capability, focus on places where they're using a fewer number of TTPs, right? Like if initial access is primarily focused on, compromising an email account, for example, right? Let's make sure that our password policy, our geolocation, impossible travel rules, like all of those things are in place to make their initial access as difficult as possible. If they have, if that's where that singular choke point exists.
Mhm. Yeah. And then getting more advanced is intel requirements. You
Hmm.
know, thinking through these reports and kind of seeking the reports out and saying to yourself, or just asking the question, or having this proposed is, what are you trying to mitigate? What are you trying to detect? What are you trying to prevent? Kind of things. And then you go into the report with specific things that you're looking, and that kind of helps speed up the process. It helps you focus and kind of prioritize again on the specific things that you're looking for. So if like, hey, we know we're weak in lateral movement, let's go look at what threat actors are doing for lateral movement and try and identify what they're doing and map that back to our defensive controls and mitigation so we can kind of prevent that, get ahead of that thing.
Yep, absolutely agree, man. Absolutely. Um, yeah, yeah. Keep going, man. This is great.
So we talked about quick wins a little bit, adding high confidence IOCs to your SIM, your EDR, adding bad IPs or known malicious IPs to block lists and things like that. We talked a little bit about biases, but I'll touch on it again because there's one thing I wanted to mention. And it's that government tends to be a little bit more cautious, whereas vendors kind of lean more on marketing and kind of like how their tool solves this problem kind of thing. So that's something that you mostly notice most of the time. Outfits like the DFIR report are very fact based. Like there's very little marketing that gets in the way of those reports. Like they sell services and they have stuff that they sell, but the report is very much highly valuable, and all of the things in there that would relate to the stuff that they sell doesn't take away from the report. Not all reports are like that. Not all threat intel reports and vendor reports are like that. So keep that in mind. And then you mentioned this as well, and then we can move on. Is there is a analysis paralysis kind of drinking from the fire hose thing. If you download a report, right, and it's like 100-page report, it's like the DBIR is a great example. DBIR is a huge report, huge, and that's where focusing on your industry, focusing on the threats that you're facing, and kind of going through it from that lens as opposed to just reading it front to back, I think will be really helpful.
Yeah, no question, dude. And one thing that you have on here that I really, really like is don't rely on a single source. So when you're going through these threat intel reports, generally speaking, there will be other published data on threat actors and TTPs that are in those reports. So you can go out and read threat researcher blogs. You can go out and look at cases that were well documented of attacks and things of that nature. So I would, really advise you to do a little bit of research once you've identified a threat actor that lives in your vertical. Go find out as much as you can about them. To your point, in a lot of cases, these reports will be missing information or maybe have too much in some cases, right, for you to sift through. So definitely recommend that you guys use other sources to validate these things before you go making changes in your environment.
Yeah, definitely. So now I know we're at like the 30-minute mark, but bear with us another like 5 or 10 minutes. We'll do like a speed run of one of these reports. So up on my screen right now. So for anybody who's listening on the podcast, if you go over to the Cyber Threat POV YouTube channel, that's where we post the video podcast there, and you'll be able to see my screen and kind of walk through this. But I'm just looking at one of the latest DFIR reports. So what I want to emphasize is, I'm going to look at this at a lens of stuff that we have a pretty good idea won't typically get blocked outright by EDR. So, for example, the threat actor uses Mimikatz in this. If you download Mimikatz and you run it, it's probably going to get blocked. And if not, I would check to see if your antivirus is even turned on. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm really focused on techniques. I'm focused on methodology and kind of understanding what the threat actor is doing and a little bit of kind of where they're going or why they're heading in that direction. So we can get a sense of what their motivations are to kind of get in front of it, get ahead of it.
Love it.
So I'm going to jump to, by the way, the DFIR report is super great. They have got a key takeaway section. They've got their services, obviously, but then they've got a great table of contents. So you can quickly jump to each section. So I'm going to jump to initial access. So this all started from a Confluence RCE. So remote code execution vulnerability in Confluence. So that's how the threat actor got in. Obviously, a takeaway is and I mentioned this earlier, if you have Confluence, it's not patched, you should patch it super quickly. But that goes for all the other software that's on the internet, right, that you are using, your SaaS products, anything that you're hosting. The time to exploitation has never been faster, and it continues to exponentially get quicker every single week, every single month. And there are numerous examples we can point to that indicate to that. But for me, kind of quick takeaways, if I'm like a cybersecurity person defending an organization or a SOC analyst is I'm looking at, the exploit path, I'm looking at user agents, and probably like the content of the request for this exploit. So we can see that there's a post request for, let me zoom in on this. There's a post request for /template/AUI text inline right there. And if it looks a little bit small, let me.
Well, we can link to the report. So
yeah, I'll link to the report, but I'll do my best to zoom in. But anyways, kind of looking at the post request, looking at the commands that were run, or the body of the post request to look for suspicious indicators there, and what a threat actor might potentially be using for this exploit. So those are some of the quick things that I think of right immediately, like in the initial access section.
Mm-hmm.
Going down to execution, AnyDesk, right? I mentioned AnyDesk earlier. They eventually get AnyDesk installed by other means, and that's one of the things I wanted to touch on was AnyDesk, lolbins, and encoded PowerShell. So I mentioned earlier LOL RMM. It's a website that you can go to look at all the different RMM products. If you're not blocking every single RMM except the ones you use, you're kind of leaving an opportunity for threat actors, right? Mm-hmm. Or you're leaving opportunity for abuse. You're allowing them to get on second base. So what this indicates to me is if I don't have some sort of app control where I can block those things, that's something I potentially might need, right? I need some way to block these very legitimate remote management tools from executing in my environment. So we can look at RMMs. We can, create rules for AnyDesk or the various other RMM tools for encoded PowerShell. Those are all things that I think are very quick wins that you can implement in your environment that are pretty noticeable. Going down further to persistence, we see more AnyDesk, right? And again, points to the RMM thing and kind of blocking those using app control, WDAC, or third-party products, but also new user creation. This is something we test for in all of our purple teams, and I would say most of the time it's not getting detected. And that is, if you create a new user and add it to the local admins group, is that being alerted on, right? It should be. And if it's not, you need to create some rules for it, because this is a very common technique for threat actors to maintain persistence, right? They install an RMM, and then they will create a new user so that if the user account that they compromised initially gets disabled or locked out or something like that, they have an account that they can still use and get into as a local admin.
Yep, persistence is a thing.
Yeah, definitely. And like it says here, the new user backup was created, right? And this is all very, very much detectable. Most EDR platforms, so when we do our pen tests, most EDR platforms have the logs for this. They have the telemetry to be able to alert on this, but not all of them do.
Yep.
So this is something you could really quickly and easily test in your environment. Moving on to credential access. We scroll down, credential access. So like I said, Mimikatz was executed. We're going to skip past that, right? Mimikatz by itself should, is probably getting detected by most AV EDR products. But the thing I wanted to focus on with credential access is the Veeam credentials. So they used an open source tool called Veeam Creds. It's on GitHub. You can download it and test it in your environment. Obviously, you want to read through the code, understand it, all that. But you could test this in your environment to see what logs get created, what events are generated, and look for things that you can use to key on to identify that activity. And then this kind of illustrates the importance of script block logging. So script block logging is when the contents of PowerShell scripts gets logged, which I believe there's a screenshot down here. So script block logging is really important to have turned on. Your EDR product does get some of this telemetry by itself, but I always think it's a good idea if you have a SIM to turn on script block logging and send those logs to your SIM anyways, so you have a secondary source that you can key off of things and build alerts and detections on. The other kind of aspect of this is the plain text credentials. So the threat actor discovered a text file on a file share that contained IT related clear text passwords
What a surprise.
for the domain admin account.
That
I
never happens, dude. That never happens. What are you talking
Yeah.
about?
Yeah, and I can't tell you how realistic this is. And this is one of the reasons why I love DFIR report, because it points out things like this. This is the real stuff. Like, it's not always zero, like fancy 0 days, and they get in like they're doing all this sophisticated stuff. It's like compromised account. They log in, they search the shares, admin credentials. This stuff is super real, and it's out there in many environments. And just, to me, the takeaway as a defender is like, I should probably just go look in my shares right now,
Hmm.
or run a script, or just, check regularly, just to make sure my admins, just to make sure I didn't accidentally leave credentials out there, or something that a threat actor could use, right?
Yep. And just for a side quip, last week you were able to, before noon on day one, get system level access to the crown jewels on your pen test, right?
Yeah, SQL creds in a web config on a file share, right? That shouldn't have been there. It
Yeah.
is the exact same scenario.
Yeah, man. So this is, to your point, very realistic, and it happens all the flipping time. And what I love the most about this is it's something you can fix on your own for free
Mm.
without any tools, right? You can literally use Windows search to go
Yep.
search these things and find stuff. So, you don't need a high level of sophistication. You don't need all these fancy tools. The TTPs in a lot of these cases are relatively simple. Like, they haven't done anything yet that is like, oh wow, that's super crazy. Like, it's all standard
Yep.
stuff, man.
Yeah, definitely. One funny thing from the discovery section is the threat actor accidentally killed their their remote session, their C2 session. So they had to re-exploit the vulnerability in Confluence to get back in.
That's amazing.
So they killed their interpreter session and they had to re-exploit it, and it was kind of a funny thing. There are some funny things that threat actors do, like mistyping commands, or funny things like that you could actually, kind of key on, because if you know some of the patterns that are common mistakes, and one of them is like running shell who am I on the shell. So like threat actor will initiate like a CMD process, and then they'll run shell who am I. Shell is a BOF in Cobalt Strike for running shell commands. So you have to run shell and then the thing. And sometimes that'll show up in these reports. Kind of a
It's kind of
funny,
funny. Yeah.
sidebar. Another thing I wanted to point out was NetScan. So NetScan is a otherwise legitimate, network scanner. It can do network scans. It can look at shares and, some other fun stuff. But this again indicates to me the behavior of the threat actor, right? They would prefer to use known legitimate software like AnyDesk, like NetScan, etc., for their operations and for their, tooling than, write some custom, thing. Takes a lot of time. Maybe it's all custom, and they just like to use stuff that's known, trusted, signed, built in, just use with the tools that they have available to them.
Hmm. Makes sense, right? It's easy.
Lateral movement for RDP. We talked about that a little bit already. The one takeaway I have for lateral movement, kind of RDP, is firms are now implementing MFA on RDP, right? Or at least for admin sessions on RDP, using like Duo or Okta or something like that. What's great is they have MFA, but you also have to look at the other protocols like PS remoting, SMB. There are other protocols that you can use to enumerate processes remotely or move laterally to another host that are not RDP based, right? So you need to be looking at those and kind of identifying how to restrict those. But this is an indicator that says, hey, I should probably make sure RDP is pretty locked down, or like my servers are isolated, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The last two things, and then we'll wrap up because I know we're going a little long. Command and control. So the hosting providers was this, if I can find it, Fly servers.
Mm-hmm.
Fly servers. There it is. So this threat actor used a hosting provider called Fly servers, and it's been reported before in other blogs that it's being used by Lockbit, right? So
Mhm.
remember when I said we want to kind of understand who it is that's doing the attack? This is a good indicator that it's some sort of ransomware group that is conducting this attack, right, or an affiliate of Lockbit in this case. So
Mhm.
having that information is important because you can kind of piece together some of their methodologies or techniques that they would use as opposed to a threat actor. So a
Yep.
nation or a nation state, right? A nation state might drop some custom built like command and control like malware and be very sophisticated. Lockbit's going to use Meterpreter and Metasploit and off the shelf kind of open source C2 frameworks, and they're going to use AnyDesk and stuff like that. Uh, the last piece is the impact section, and this is becoming something that I've noticed more popular. Is PDQ deploy being used for ransomware? PDQ deploy is a great automation tool for IT admins. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but it's also great for threat actors, right?
Yeah.
And this goes back to application control and just understanding the techniques that threat actors are using to perform their operations. And PDQ deploy is becoming more popular, just like RMM products are becoming more popular.
Yep.
So that's my like 10 or 12-minute speed run on looking at threat reports.
Yeah. No, it's great, man. I mean, it's some really good points in this, and this would be another one of those that I would point to as a good starting point for establishing test runs, right? Is this confluence there's enough good information in there to help you identify what's valuable. And one thing I want to add, and I know we're up on time, but one of the things that we would do is create a supplementary report that was intended for consumption by executives, and that report would contain, here are all the controls that we have, here are the categories of TTPs that the threat actor is using that falls into that same thing, right? So we'll just use EDR because it's an easy example. All right. So would we successfully detect initial access? Yes or no? Or unsure, right? And how we're going to figure that out. And so we would map these things. You actually had some notes in here about mapping, and that's something that we would do is we would report on, what the threat actor was doing, where we would catch it in our security stack, what our confidence level was, and then we would go fix it. Right? If it wasn't a 10 out of 10 confidence that we would identify that, that's my new job. That's the
Mm.
only thing that I'm going to do for the next 48 hours is figure out how we're going to address that. But breaking it down into that will help you identify two things. One, are the controls you have working relative to the threats you're facing? And two, do you even have controls in some of these categories? Because I think some people might be surprised to find out that they might not even have visibility into some of this stuff.
Yep.
So, listing out your controls, comparing them to the TTPs will help you get a long way in identifying your readiness for some of these threat actors.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the ultimate goal, right? It's to make our organization a little bit more secure today than it was yesterday. That's
Mhm.
why our podcast exists for that same reason. So remembering your goals and why you're going through these reports is super helpful.
Yep, absolutely, man. So, one quick note, you want to cover the closeout?
Yeah, yeah. So, quick call to action for those still listening. So we dedicate, if it's not obvious, we dedicate a lot of time every week to create notes and episodes and outlines for these podcasts. So if you we'd be super appreciative if you would share the link to the podcast on LinkedIn with your network. Our goal is, like I said, to help organizations be a little bit more secure today than they were yesterday. That's kind of the tagline that I think of in my head of like why we do the podcast. By sharing it, you kind of help out with your network. You help your peers kind of get some information or wisdom or whatever you might take away from these episodes. Maybe they're entertaining for you, but we get to help more people. We get to reach more people. We don't really plug our services that much in these episodes. We're really trying to provide value. And we just want to reach more people. So if you would share this with your network, we'd be super appreciative and super thankful.
Yep. And you can head over to offsec.blog and see some of the stuff that we do, white papers. The episodes are out there with more detail and stuff like that as well. So that's all we have time for today, folks. We'll see you next week.